Okay. Hey, Luke and Ezra, can you guys hear me? And one of you just confirm that you can hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm going to mute me, and Dr. Fiskia is going to join from her computer, but I just wanted to make sure I was recording.
Gotten to the point of using the room cameras, but I know other people have.
I don't even know if this one has cameras. I don't think it does. It's got this mic here, but I don't think it has a camera. It's not that I'm aware of. So it's just, it'll just be this
I got it.
camera, and you know, if you just share your whole screen,
Yep.
it will actually do a weird thing where it's going to display what's on this screen if you use a PowerPoint, so it'll have your notes in it, but I don't use notes.
That's what I I don't need notes, but I like to sort of see where I've been and where I'm
Right,
going.
so do I. So, but they'll see that. It doesn't make a difference. That's just the way I just like do full screen and then
That's what I'm gonna do.
yeah. So you can probably see that I'm recording, and maybe I'll do.
So welcome, folks. We're going to have a slightly small class today. If you guys haven't noticed, there's kind of like I don't know, a bit of COVID going around campus all of a sudden now, and so there's a bunch of students who are basically on Zoom today from this class. A lot of them just because they're associated with groups who may have been exposed to COVID. So it's a little bit smaller class today. But it is my great pleasure and honor today to be introducing one of my colleagues, Jay Fiskio, who's been teaching in the program since 2009. Oh,
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to mute from here. Sorry, John.
Yeah. That's all. In fact, one of the pleasures of this course is getting to introduce you to a bunch of my colleagues who I work with in this program. One of the things that we talk about a lot in environmental studies is the interdisciplinarity of the field as a whole. And for me personally, it's been just such a pleasure to work with people who really come from very different perspectives, look at environmental issues very, very differently from the way I do. And we've gotten really lucky in this program that we also happen to have a really nice group of people to work with. So I have all these colleagues who I just really enjoy spending time with. So it's definitely nice to have them come into the class and have them give them an opportunity to share their work and their approaches with you. Years ago, when our environmental studies program was looking around the country and sort of thinking about the field, thinking about where we wanted to go, one of our real recognitions was that most environmental studies programs kind of bifurcate into, sort of a set of faculty and courses that focus on natural sciences, and then more or less a set of faculty and courses that focus on political science, maybe some other social sciences, economics in there occasionally, but that this core way of thinking and knowing about the world that comes from the field of humanities was more or less left out of a good part of the discussion. There was some eco-criticism literature in there too. People had that in there. We talked about Aldo Leopold. He's certainly someone who's been taught for years within environmental studies, but we weren't giving the kind of centrality to environmental humanities that we thought was really sort of critical to a full understanding of human relationships with each other and the natural planet. So we said, hey, we want to hire someone who's going to explicitly focus on this area and who's going to teach a required course in this area. So if you move on in environmental studies, or if you simply have more interest in environmental studies, one of the courses that I'd highly recommend you take is our Introduction to Environmental Humanities, which Jay was more or less hired to develop that course for us when she arrived at Oberlin. So just to say a little bit about Jay's background, just to give you a sense of the diversity of places we come from. Jay went to one of our peer institutions, Earlham College, and got a degree, but also a master's degree in divinity. First, she got a PhD in University of Oregon in environmental science and studies and policy. As I said, she joined our faculty in 2009. Jay has a joint appointment in comparative American studies as well, which I think says something about the interdisciplinary nature of our programs. As mentioned, she was hired to develop this new course, but also one of the things that we felt was really missing was a focus, a humanities perspective on climate change. And it wasn't an area that Jay had sort of previously focused on, but I'm really proud to say she just published sort of this formative book on humanities perspective on climate change, which I think is going to be really important just this last year with Cambridge University Press, which is a really important press. So Jay is sort of at the forefront of this thinking about climate change from a humanities perspective. She teaches a number of upper level courses, as I mentioned, the Introduction to Environmental Humanities courses, which is required for the major, but also a course in climate change, ethics, equity, and narratives. Of course, in American agriculture, one of her areas of expertise is sort of food systems, food justice. She teaches courses in environmental justice literature, environmental repair, environmental justice and local knowledge, Africatown immersion. She's got this really neat program in Africatown, Alabama, which she may say a little bit about today, and community engagement in public humanities. So a lot of different areas. What else did I want to mention? Oh, I wanted to say one thing that I think begins to talk about differences in perspectives, and that is certainly the approach that I come at ES from, and that most social scientists as well come at ES from, is from this perspective of problem solving, environmental problem solving. That is, we try to identify what are the environmental challenges we face and what are the sort of options available for solving those challenges. Jay said something to me once, which has sort of stuck with me, which is that I'll actually quote her on this. She said, "My job is to cause problems," and I think it comes part and parcel with this sort of humanities perspective. It would sort of like, I think I'll leave it with
That sounds great.
comment.
That's
I'll let you
great,
explain what
great.
that might mean.
Sure.
Okay, so great pleasure
Thank
to
you.
introduce this, yeah.
So I actually, after John started talking, I decided to open this up here. These photographs. So let's see. Of course, this is the problem when you try to do something and then you move things around. Does not want to go. But anyway, I want to say first, thank you to John. Something John is not taking credit for, but he should, is that when I first got here, in fact, it was about, when I was being hired back in 2008, there was not a lot of environmental work on the humanities, as John said. And there's not a lot of humanities work and environmental humanities work on climate change, as John said. And that was something I was anxious about coming in, not sure what that was going to look like. I hadn't been very interested in it because the work that was coming out wasn't very interested, and it was really powerful. I really grew being here at Oberlin, getting to teach the climate change class and learning from my fellow faculty and learning from my students. It's really been an evolving dialogue. And so this book I published, which was kind of a grueling task, really came out of my time teaching here. And it's not something I ever would have done on my own. And I want to just unmute this. I had muted it earlier to keep from the feedback. So John also mentioned the Africatown collaboration. I just wanted to give you a little snapshot. We went to a conference this past weekend in New Orleans called the HBCU, Historically Black Colleges and Universities Climate Conference. And this is us after we had been traveling for about 11 hours because we got stuck because of tornadoes in one location, thunderstorms in New Orleans. And this is the people on the floor of the Nashville airport. But then I can show you the good news of what it came out, which is our students won third place for their poster presentation. And this is Major Joe Womack, who is our community collaborator. So it all turned out to be great. And I do really encourage you to continue taking classes in environmental studies and to continue with Environmental Studies 201 is one of my favorite classes to teach. Actually, I teach it pretty much every semester, and I still look forward to it every semester because I get to meet the whole range of our environmental studies students. And along the lines of what John and I have been talking about, which is the fact that I have really grown into thinking about the climate change from a humanities perspective. Environmental studies as a discipline gives you that room to grow, and that's probably the thing I value the most about it. We are not people in environmental studies who come in and just do one thing for 30 years. We all end up kind of branching out and moving around, and we're constantly learning and learning along with you. So for my talk today, I want to talk about environmental justice and environmental humanities, and I want to talk about my own research a little bit. And I want to talk a little bit about thinking about this from the perspective of where we are. So these are two ways of thinking for me about where we are. One is that we are on indigenous land. We are in the Wyandot territory, and we are in the Great Lakes region. So this is by Ann Heffernan, who is a first, she's in Anishinaabe, Curve Lake First Nation in Canada. And this is her beautiful depiction of the Great Lakes. And what I love about it is the Anishinaabe name for the Great Lakes is the place where food grows on water, which is wild rice. And I think she depicts that really beautifully through this painting. The other one, this is a painting that is from the book Farming While Black by Leah Penniman. It's done by Naima Penniman. And it shows what research has documented is that Black women, when they were being enslaved and taken onto the slave ships, they would braid seeds into their hair. So seeds like okra, like rice, and would bring that in their braids so that they knew they could plant. Or they didn't know, right? The future was unimaginable at that point, but they brought seeds with them. And I think it's really powerful that both of these paintings focus on food and how essential food is, but it also focuses on the idea that I'll be talking a lot about environmental racism today and the problems of environmental injustice. But I like the fact that both of these paintings show how nature is also and primarily a source of joy and life and resurgence and healing for communities of color. And that it's not always it or only or primarily a space that's negative. Okay. So thinking a little bit about the humanities, I feel like we are out of practice in our culture. We're out of practice in the United States in talking about values. And I think that actually comes from a place of respect. People, especially Oberlin students, do not want to impose their beliefs or their values on other people. So we have a hard time kind of talking about them. But we really can't talk about environmental justice without talking about values. And that's part of what the humanities is supposed to be doing. The disciplines of philosophy and religion and ethics, these are long traditions to try to think through what are our values and how do we agree on things together to form the kind of world that we want to live in. It can't just be something that's completely individualized. And in one of the nice things about environmental studies is that we do both of those, right? So the question of is climate change happening? That is a question that gets answered by the natural sciences, right? It's not a belief, even though it gets talked about that way, right? And certain kinds of TV talk shows or whatever, people say, well, I don't believe it's happening. It's really not a question of belief. It's a question of science. Science has demonstrated that climate change is happening. But if you ask, what should we do about climate change? Things get more complicated. I was just in New Orleans, and I remember after Hurricane Katrina, which was a climate change influenced event. The size of hurricanes and the intensity of hurricanes is growing. The size of Katrina was, I don't have the facts to figure out in my head, but we can see that these kinds of large events, these catastrophic events, these events of flooding that are hitting Houston and Florida and Mississippi and New Orleans, these are climate change influenced. But one of the things that people initially said after Katrina hit New Orleans was, well, maybe we should move people out of New Orleans because it's below sea level and the wetlands have already been destroyed by petrochemical companies and they're continuing to subside, and it's going to be very difficult to manage climate change. But when you say something like that, it might sound practical. It might sound like, what it doesn't look at is what would the impact be on people's lives to be forced to move out of these communities. These are Black communities that have existed since enslavement. The Congo Square is the place where African traditions of ritual and drumming have existed since enslavement. So we need to think about all of these different factors, all of these different things that matter to people when we start to make decisions about how do we deal with climate change. So just saying, you folks who are living in this area that's low-lying because it was originally a place where enslaved peoples lived and then it was redlined and it was the less desirable place to live, now you have to move. That's not fair, right? It doesn't take into account what neighborhoods mean to people, what communities mean to people, what history, what it means to live in the house that your grandfather bought when he came back as a veteran from World War II. Those are all values as well that we need to take into account when we start thinking about climate change and how we deal with it. So this is from an article by Dale Jameson that I actually teach in my climate change class that I think is a really good one, even though it's older. And one of the things he talks about is that values are not the same as preferences. They're not always explicit. We might hold values, right? But not even really understand them ourselves. They might be something we grew up with. They might be something that we have absorbed from the culture around us without really thinking about it. Sometimes our values might contradict each other. I think that for me, having been around Quakers and learning about peace activism, I'm like, gee, I really believe in this idea that we should deal with things non-violently. And then I see the war in Ukraine, and I'm like, I think, it starts to make me think about, like, what do I really think about people defending their country? I need to think through my values on this. I don't really know. And then the idea that values are constructed more by society and individuals, just the idea that the society we live in is going to be the primary thing that shapes our values. At what point most people in the United States thought enslaving Black Americans was okay. Now, luckily, I believe, really, most people do not believe that anymore. Even if they have racist belief systems, I think they probably would not agree that slavery is okay. So one example I use for values and thinking about the fact that our values can change, we talk about them as though they are very individualized, right? Even though they're really more a part of the society that we're in. And we talk about values as though they're irrational, right? It's just you believe in God or you don't believe in God, and that's your belief system. But a belief and a value aren't exactly the same thing, and a preference and a value are not exactly the same thing. So the example that I always use when I talk about this is strawberry ice cream, which is, I don't really like strawberry ice cream. I never have. I've like, whenever I had a choice when I was a kid about what kind of ice cream was good, I never got strawberry ice cream. That's a preference. You can't give me reasons why I should like strawberry ice cream. And I can't change maybe my taste will change through time, but you can't force yourself to start liking a flavor that you don't like. But if you ask a question, something I do really enjoy is fresh strawberries. And as I have done more and more research about sort of food and farm labor and the courses that I'm teaching, I've learned that the strawberries that we buy are being picked right under terrible conditions for immigrant and undocumented workers. So I really enjoy them. But then when I start thinking about buying strawberries, it becomes part of a value system. It becomes part of a question of, like, what choices am I making with my life and what world do I want to live in with other people? And for a long time, I was like, oh, I'll just buy my strawberries from the farmer's market, and that's going to solve that problem for me personally, even if it's not solving it on a societal level. But actually, a lot of small farmers, if you're someone who is who's buying strawberries at a green market in New York City that are being grown in the Hudson Valley, it's very likely that in fact those strawberries were also picked by immigrant and undocumented workers, because it's the only way that those small farms can stay competitive and their strawberries are still going to probably cost twice what they would in a supermarket. But it's the only way that they can actually survive as a small farm, is to have those same labor practices as the industrialized farms. So that also shows us the limits of our consumer power, right? I can myself, I'm one of those white people who goes to picks my own strawberries. And I'm like, oh, I love picking my own strawberries, and I bring them home. And it's all very pleasurable. But doing that is not changing this whole system in which immigrant and undocumented workers are picking the fruits and vegetables that we grow and are living in terrible conditions because of it. So that's why we need to be able to have that conversation about values and start thinking about how do we enact our values at different levels of the system. I'm not saying it's not worth it to pick your own strawberries, to grow your own strawberries, to shop at the farmer's market. Those are all important things too. And those are ways that we can live lives that are consistent with our values, where we don't want to cause suffering, right, to other people. But we also need to be able to have conversations collectively to make these kinds of structural changes that need to happen. So talking about values today, environmental justice relies on certain values. It relies on values of fairness, it relies on values of justice, it relies on values of being anti-racist and being, dealing with the structural kinds of issues that we face in our society. So I'm going to quickly kind of gloss the first three of these definitions. And then today, I want us to be talking about decolonial and reparative justice as a group. Distributive justice is the kind of classic formulation of environmental justice. When it first began to be talked about by the United Church of Christ in 1980, they published the first document on environmental racism in the United States. What people discovered in doing these studies is that regardless of income, so it's not about class or poverty, regardless of income, communities of color, in particular, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, were more likely to have polluting industries located in their neighborhoods. Lots of reasons for this: historical redlining, racism in the system, disempowerment of communities. So that's the distributive piece. It says that in a fair society, in an equal and equitable society, the burdens of pollution would be equally shared among different neighborhoods and different groups of people, and the benefits of those industries would be equally shared. And that does not happen in the United States. The EPA, if you go work for the EPA, a lot of what you're going to be doing is trying to figure out, how do we equalize the system of, we have lots of pollution being produced in this country. How do we make sure that certain communities are not targeted for that pollution, those undesirable industries? And how do we make sure that all communities are sharing equally in the monetary and other benefits that come out of that? Related to this is the idea of procedural justice. Procedural justice is something I think Oberlin students actually understand really well. It's the idea that anybody who is going to be affected by a decision should have some kind of participation in making that decision. It's about democracy. So it's saying everybody, all the affected, stakeholders in the decision should have a part in making that decision. This does not happen very often. Sometimes, even when the government or the EPA says, here are the procedures you need to follow to do an environmental impact statement, and you have to let the community know, and you have to gain at least, if not consent of the community, you have to consult with the community. Industries find ways around that all the time. There are sneaky ways to do it, and there are obvious ways to do it. One thing that was happening for a long time was that in Latinx neighborhoods, signs were only being put up in English. So maybe there would be a sign that said, this area is being considered for, a hazardous waste storage facility. But if it was in English and most of the people in the neighborhood didn't read English, but were Spanish speakers, that was not really fulfilling the requirements of procedural justice. So again, EPA, government, a lot of my friends who I went to grad school with, who got Master of Science in environmental science and studies, they are working on these kinds of policies and these kinds of procedures. Corrective justice is something that I think we understand on a intuitive level in the United States. The United States is a very punitive society, actually. And this kind of gets into those of you who are kind of thinking about mass incarceration, this sort of thing. Corrective justice says, if you harm someone, you should be punished for that, and you should have to make some kind of payment. You should have to make some kind of restitution. This works well, or has worked well, or has been developed in a time when we were thinking about ways that crimes or harms that are easier to trace. So this is like, if somebody steals your bicycle, then first of all, they have to give it back or pay you for it if they've ruined it. And also they probably have to have some sort of consequence for their behavior, right? That's the corrective piece. It's both making sure that the wrong has been righted and trying to find some way to correct this person's behavior so they don't do it in the future. These kinds of ideas, distributed procedural corrective, start to break down when we're talking about climate change, because climate change and the harms of climate change are something that has happened over many generations, right? At least since the Industrial Revolution, or we can trace it back farther. And they're distant in time, right? They're things that people have done. Cars that my grandfather was driving have impacted the atmosphere. He's not around anymore to try to make restitution. So it's distance in space, and distance in time, but it's also distance in space, right? it's hard for us, I think, on a everyday level to think about how are my actions that I am doing now contributing to a system and to a feedback system that is affecting people in Bangladesh. Probably at Oberlin, we spend more time talking about these things and have a better, at least a better sort of scientific understanding of how that works. But it is hard in our society to get people to think about that. People think you did something wrong, you should pay for what you did wrong. But our harms are diffuse, they're collective, and they're distance in space and time, they're affecting future generations, right? So these are all things that make climate change a particularly difficult question to deal with in terms of our values and in terms of our actions and in terms of our concepts of justice. And that's where I think decolonial and reparative justice can be helpful, because those are both ideas that bring us into a longer term concept. So I'm going to move from these kind of definitions right now, knowing that we're going to keep talking about decolonial and reparative, but I want to talk a little bit about where we are right now, which is the Great Lakes. So here's another way to think about the Great Lakes. This is a Google Earth, and then here's I think another beautiful map. This is from an interesting website that you might want to take a look at called the Decolonial Atlas, where people are doing really cool things with maps and getting us to think about the world in a different way by reorienting our maps. So one thing you probably noticed right away about the Great Lakes here is that it's no longer a north-south orientation, which is what a conventional or Western map would do. It's an east, where the map east is at the top. And that's because east is an important location in the Anishinaabe worldview. People came from the east, is the migration story, the origin story, is that people came from the east and stopped at the place where they found food growing on the water. And then it also has all of these Anishinaabe names that have been returned to the landscape here. So just different ways of thinking about where we are. One of the most important things about the Great Lakes is that we have 1/5 of the world's surface fresh water. We have a huge amount of water here. And I think as climate change continues, this is something David Orr said way back when he was still teaching here, the Great Lakes are going to become a very important place in climate change. They are, we have water, we have infrastructure, we have no earthquakes, and we don't have this sort of forest fire problem that they're having like in the West because of our climate and other things. So the Great Lakes and the fact that we have so much water here, fresh water, drinkable water, is really key as we're thinking about the future. But one of the environmental justice issues here is that although the Great Lakes have a lot of water, our society, in my opinion, has not really treated water the way that it should. When we think about, I'm going to go back to this one. When you think about this worldview or the initial painting that I showed to you, this idea is that water is a gift, right? Water is something that is sacred, and water is something that is meant to be protected and shared. That's one way of thinking about water. Another way of thinking about water is as a natural resource that can be commodified. So we know that, for example, in Michigan, which is part of the Great Lakes, there are corporations that are bottling water and making a lot of money off of water at the same time that they're polluting other people's water supplies. One of the things that happened when I first got to Oberlin, it was a couple of years after I got to Oberlin actually, but early on in my time here, was the city of Detroit went into emergency management, is what it's called. So it was bankrupt because there had been white flight from the city. So there was not enough taxes being paid to maintain infrastructure. And water was very expensive. Right around this time when the Detroit water shut off started happening, which is that the people who were behind the water bill had their water shut off. People who are behind on their water bill are people who are having to make hard choices every month about what they're paying for, right? Are you going to pay for food? Are you going to pay for gas to get to work because we don't have public transportation? So you have to have a car most of the time to be able to continue to earn money. Are you going to pay for electricity this month? Is it winter? Or are you going to pay for water this month because it's summer? So people who were behind on their water bills, who were mainly lower income, who were mainly Black, because it's a primarily Black city, started having their water shut off by the city during this emergency management. And the thing that is really, that I like, the thing that I think is smart about this meme is that it shows that those water shutoffs were an economic and political decision, right? There's no ecological or natural reason why people in Detroit should be without water. We're in a place that has some of the most accessible water in the world. So that's a value decision that was being made. It was a value decision being made by governments and at some extent by voters. We know voting has a, there's a whole other thing going on with voting now. But that was a choice that our society made to say, if you can't afford water, we're shutting your water off, no matter what impact that has on you. No matter if that means your children have to go to school wearing dirty clothes or not being allowed to shower. These are terrible things to do to people. These are terrible choices to force people to make. So this is what happened in Detroit. And then there was another water issue in the Great Lakes region. So Flint. Have some of you heard about Flint? And hopefully you got to see the documentary. Okay. So one of the other ways to think about environmental justice and water is that if the water, there's one thing about, is water affordable for people? Can they afford to buy water? And the other question is the water safe, right? And what happened to the people in Flint was that their water was not safe, as you saw in the documentary, because of certain decisions that were made to try to save money. And then when this happened, as far as I know that in the Biden infrastructure, Harris infrastructure bill, there's money in that bill to replace lead pipes. But at this time, people in Flint are still living with unsafe water. And so either if you have the money, you can move away, or if you have the money, you can buy bottled water. But if you don't have the money to do either of those things, then people are continuing to live in a situation where our country is not providing safe water. And you saw in the documentary, right, that lead poisoning has irreparable effects, especially on children, especially on children's development. So again, this is a crime, right? This is a terrible thing that is being done to people who live in Flint. There's also concerns, by the way, about lead pipes in Milwaukee, in Cleveland, all of these cities that were sort of Western industrial cities that were in Midwestern industrial cities built about the same time have the same problem. It's a problem that we need to address as a society. It is not enough to tell people, go buy bottled water if you don't like drinking water that has lead in it. This is not an issue that can be dealt with by individual kind of consumer responses. Do people have any comments or thoughts about the documentary? Were there things that stood out to you about that documentary? So one of the things that I want to sort of point out, going along with the Corbin reading you did about local knowledge, the people of Flint, when did they start reporting the problems and what things did they notice? Do you remember that? How did the people of Flint first sort of become aware that there was a change in their water? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought it was on there. Okay, good. Thank you for telling me that. Okay, I
I don't know if it's the same documentary, but I saw something on this in a previous class. Like, I think their water was like literally yellow.
Right. I'm sorry. You read the chapter on it. I'm so sorry, everyone. So what happens this time of year? Okay, so yeah, people started noticing the color of the water changed. They noticed it was foamy. They started noticing they were getting rashes, that it tasted funny. So all of these everyday things. This is a very common experience not common, but a commonly reported way of knowing in the environmental justice movement is that very often it's through these everyday experiences that people start noticing something in their environment has changed, right? Sometimes it's moms, doing very ordinary things like cooking dinner or bathing their baby and realizing their baby has a rash. That's part of what happened in Flint. And unfortunately, those kinds of knowledge, it's not taken seriously, right? Authorities will dismiss it. They say, oh, this will pass, you know, your kid will get used to the new water, or no, you're wrong, it doesn't taste funny, or no, you're wrong, there isn't a problem here. And in Flint is a classic case of the fact that local people began organizing and fighting back against this change in the water. But the problem is that, number one, the lead pipes have still not been replaced. And number two, the impact on these families, especially the ones whose children have been impacted by lead poisoning, has not been dealt with. And that's where we start getting the language of reparations. This idea that when a harm has been done, there needs to be some sort of repair done, not just a correction, not just a money payment. Reparative justice asks us to think about both the fact that there needs to be full acknowledgement of what's happened, right? There needs to be an apology for what's happened. And then there needs to be both maybe a monetary compensation, and there needs to be structural or systems change. It's not enough to say, okay, we will give you some money for the fact that your kid was harmed by lead, but we're going to continue to allow lead pipes to exist all across the country and continue to harm more children. A reparative point of view is going to say, no, it's not enough to just pay off individuals or punish the particular, politicians who are part of it. We need as a society to make a change. So that's where the reparative piece comes in. So real quickly, okay, I'm having fun talking through this with you, but I should probably move a little faster. The same time that the shutoffs were happening, I took a group of students to Detroit so we could meet with environmental justice activists there and learn from them. And I saw that there was a tar sands processing plant in the most polluted zip code in Detroit, which says a lot. And some of you probably have learned about tar sands already, but it's a form of fossil fuel. It's extremely destructive to mine and extremely polluting to process, and it's extremely polluting to burn. It has a higher impact than kind of conventional oil in terms of its climate change effects and its polluting effects. And so once I saw that plant, I got interested in where were these tar sands coming from? Because I was told that there were tar sands processing plants here in Ohio. For a while, the largest tar sands processing plant was in Toledo. And I wanted to kind of make this connection and start thinking about how I could get engaged in dealing with these issues, thinking about them, being an activist about it. So while I was learning about everything that's going on in Detroit with water, and while I was learning about tar sands, I came across an invitation to attend something called the Tar Sands Healing Walk, which is a ceremony to pray for the healing of Mother Earth, is the way it's talked about. It's led by First Nations and Métis communities in Canada, up in Alberta. And it is really a long prayer. So there is people walk, and as we were, and then they stop and they pray to the four directions. So I went up to this in 2013, and then I went back in 2014 as a volunteer. And what I want to do now is show you let's see if I can manage this. Sorry. Here it is. I would like to show you a short film that was done by the group I'll Know More, which is an indigenous decolonial activist group that was started by 4 women in 2013, I believe, maybe 2012. And this is a short clip of the healing walk that I was at in 2014, which was the last healing walk. And in this, people talk about what the healing walk means to them, what environmental justice means to them, and what a sustainable future looks like to them. So what I want to encourage you to do is to watch this, watch this clip. It's about 4 minutes long, and then turn to the person next to you and talk to each other, and think about and talk through. If you were going to define what environmental justice means, that it's not just distributive, it's not just procedural, it's not just corrective, but we start thinking of it as decolonial, as in reversing the impacts of settler colonialism. reversing the impacts of industry, what would that look like? What are people saying that will look like here? And also to just think about anything that sort of stands out to you. So I'm going to go ahead and show this, and I believe, and see if it'll let me switch to, sorry, everyone. Yes, I need a new share. Okay, good. All right. I'm going to show this and then have you talk to each other for a minute, and then we'll come back as a group.
Healing walk is many things for many people. For me, it's about prayer, and it's about paying respect to the ancestors.
When we were walking, we stopped and prayed at four separate locations. The women who are leading the walk, the First Nation women, will pray and talk back over the water. This fight against natural energy extraction, it's all connected, it's all related, and it's all affecting indigenous people. And I never realized that until I came up here, that it stretches all the way up here to Canada.
This is the problems that benefit supposedly from the oil refineries, supposedly from oil leaving. And everybody's working in some capacity, and they're employed in some capacity and gaining materially from the ripping and tearing apart of our lands and our waters. And so it's difficult to get people to realize and to give up what they believe is the good life. And I tell people, you know, you come to this land of plenty. Your land of plenty is our land of demise. You are killing us with your greed.
Healing is an important process for us as Indigenous communities, a process that has to be continual. And part of that healing is being here at the Tar Sands Healing Walk in Fort McMurray, speaking about the effects of this industrial project on communities, not only in this area, but literally across Turtle Island. That healing is so important for us in moving forward. And I see that healing reflects back in the animal health we need to be doing around addressing, you know, the many different women that have been murdered, have come missing. The violence that's happening in the land is directly connected to what's happening in the
overwhelming to know. I said, we're protecting the water. But in actuality, no, protect the water. Because we can't be there for every person, you know, that's doing something, every, you know, company that's going in there. But the water is so powerful. We're not protecting the water, my friend said. She said we're standing behind the water. And we are walking with power in the water. We're trying to draw lines of connection to those communities that are fighting the pipelines across the continent of North America, whether it be Energy East, Clipper, Northern Gateway, or the Keystone XL pipeline. We feel it's absolutely imperative that we draw the connections back to the source and make those alliances and increase relationships to foster the strength and unity of the struggle.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. And I'm going to say, go ahead and talk to each other. And it can be just first what stood out to you, but then also let's start thinking about what it would mean to start defining environmental justice in a way that's that's broader, right, and more holistic and takes into account these kinds of issues that we're bringing, interconnected issues that the video brings. Talk to each other for a second, then I want to hear what you're thinking.
It's not just, you know, the history of colonialism, whatever. And I just think that needs to be kind of centered in it's not just kind of fixing the problem, but being a part in like an important part in kind of our whole machine that we have to change. Yeah, I guess well, like, there's two levels.
Okay, so seems like there's a pause. What did y'all think? And what are the things that stood out to this video, or do we starting to think about what a decolonial environmental justice would look like? What was that? Thank you. Yes.
I think one of the things that was interesting about this video is the connection that they made between the utilization of the utilization of the land by big industries,
Yeah.
And the feminization of land,
Mm-hmm.
and how that's directly connected to violence against Native women.
Yeah.
Which is something that I think generally would seem to not be related to each other, but
Right.
This kind of illustrates that they're very deeply connected to this kind of relationship going on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's a really important point that it makes. And there's two different things that I think of in terms of the impacts of industry on indigenous women. One is that these what are called sometimes man camps, these worker camps that are set up near, for example, pipeline construction or fracking sites. They're usually pretty terrible places to live. There are very high rates of violence against indigenous women near those camps. The other is something that maybe is a little more subtle, but is another kind of violence. Winona LaDuke wrote a beautiful book called All Our Relations, where she looks at the impacts of industrialization and environmental pollution. And Akwesasne, which is a indigenous community that is on the border of the United States and Canada, one of the things they discovered was because of persistent organic pollutants that were gathering in the lakes and the waterways, and indigenous women, when they were eating a traditional diet that included a lot of fish, they had so many pollutants that were gathering in their bodies that they were no longer able to breastfeed. And women have talked to, indigenous women in these communities have talked about the impact that has on their sense of their own bodies, on the sense of their bodies are too polluted to be able to care for their children the way they want to. That's another kind of violence being done to them. And it affects all different genders, right? But this is a particular thing that indigenous women have experienced and talked about, because these chemicals gather in fat cells, right? And that's what is happening when you're feeding a baby. Other thoughts? Nothing to notice. Yes, thank you.
It is the connection with the land. It is so much like just how the connection they have with their biome or with their just they know they are part of the land and the land is part of them, and then it's like there's a different like value of commodification of land, or than
Right.
thinking of the land as an animate
Exactly.
thing, whereas the industry based on the industrial Western values is just
Right.
think of the land as something that to exploit or
Exactly.
to benefit from, and then it's contrasting.
Exactly, and that is precisely with the idea that there's a whole different sort of philosophy and worldview, and that what you're bringing up is a question of value. Is water a commodity to be bought and sold? Or I think, I don't have this assigned here, but there people were carrying signs that said, protects is sacred. This idea that water is sacred, that the land is sacred, that we have relationships of reciprocity and respect with the non-human world, including animals and fish and the rivers and the land. Exactly. It's a very different point of view. It's certainly not one that's particularly compatible with capitalism. Right? Other thoughts? I thought I saw something. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it was by him, but I don't know how much this relates to the whole justice aspect, but just love the video. Really noticed the prevalence of music and how that's
Yes.
something that's like healing, a form of protest, reconnects us with each other.
Exactly. Yes. So I'm going to be getting more toward the end, but you're touching on something that I think is really key, which is we talk about protest, and protest maybe is not always the best word for talking about these kinds of actions. I think if you recall if you followed anything that was happening with the no DAPL protest back in 2016. The defenders there said, we are not protesters, we're protectors. And it was exactly about what you're talking about. It's about creation of a community and the use of things like drumming and dancing and rituals to create that community, to sustain people in the work that they're doing. And that's another way that it's another really key piece, I think, of thinking about environmental justice, which is what are the communities that form there, and how do we participate in these communities and work together to try to create this society that we would prefer to live in than the one that we're in right now. I'm going to keep going just because I'm watching the time. John, do you need any time at the end?
I'm okay.
Okay, so this is a quick slide, and this will, I will obviously show these with John. But in terms of defining what an environmental justice point of view would look like from an Indigenous point of view. So this is where she's saying how things are commonly understood and deployed. I think here she's talking about this distributive justice model. This idea of we're in a capitalist system, creating a lot of pollution. How do we distribute the benefits and burdens fairly? What Dina Helio-Whitaker is saying here is that we need to move beyond just distributing these problems and think about how do we solve these problems? How do we design better systems? So one is thinking about restorative. She uses the language of restorative. This idea that we want to restore relationships between people and between people and land. That's one way of thinking about kind of an Indigenous environmental justice perspective. So one of the things that happened when I was at the Healing Walk in 2014 was that I met these elders from Africa Town, Miss May and Miss Louise, and then Ramsey, who is an Indigenous organizer who has worked with tar sands blockade and has been living in Africa Town now for quite a while. And I had never heard of Africa Town. Says something about our education system here in the United States. Africa Town is the place where the last ship of enslaved peoples landed. It was in 1860, so it was after the international slave trade had been banned, and two slaveholder families took a bet about whether they could bring in one last ship of enslaved people, which they did. It was the ship Clotilda, and it brought in more than 100 people from West Africa and enslaved them in Alabama. But it was in 1860, so people from the Clotilda were not enslaved for very long before the Civil War was won and people were emancipated. So after emancipation, the Clotilda survivors first tried to go back to Africa. They could not afford to do this. They then went to their enslaver, who was the Lewis, Timothy Lewis, I think was his name, and said, "You owe us land for all the labor that we did for you that we never been paid for." This is recounted in a book called Barracoon by Zonia Hurston, who's an ethnographer who interviewed one of the Clotilda survivors. And Lewis laughed at them. And so they gathered their own money, they got jobs, they gathered money, and they bought their own land. One of the first things they did in 1880 was they donated land for a school. So it was the first school to educate Black children in Alabama. And they built this really thriving community. But unfortunately, like many free Black towns in the South, this is a common history. I was just in New Orleans hearing about Mossville and a bunch of other Black communities where this has happened. Because it's a Black community, because it was a lower income community, because it was still adjoining these plantation grounds that were owned by these enslaver families who still own those grounds to this day. Those enslavers took those plantation grounds and either sold or leased them to heavily polluting industries over time. So now you have a community like Africatown that is surrounded by polluting industries because they're a little pocket of this free Black town that was formed next to the plantations where it was located. So this is a map that shows Cancer Alley, which is the Mississippi River, and all of the polluting industries. So these were all plantations at one point in time. The Mississippi River, if you can think about this, in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, that was how people were shipping, right? Primarily by river out to the ocean. So people who had been growing sugar and probably indigo in Louisiana, now it's petrochemicals and vinyl and other kinds of heavily polluting industries are all occupying this landscape. But the thing that is maybe not as evident from that map, is that in and among, so this is a little close up of some of the same map, in and among all those polluting industries are these historic Black towns. And this is a map from a book called Petrochemical America. And what it shows is this is this little house in the Freedmen's town, so historically Black community. And then around dark circle means buyout or payoff. An empty circle means relocation. So you see all the relocations, right, that have happened. So these historically Black towns, like Africatown, have a great pride in their history, have a long history, have a great pride in their ancestors who freed themselves and built these towns, have been forced to be displaced because of toxic pollution. And one of the things I like to think about, we think about displacement from climate change as a thing that's going to be happening in the future. But these are petrochemical industries. So in one sense, these displacements have already happened, are already taking place. They're already ongoing, right? It may not be from specifically climate change related, but it's still petrochemical related displacements. So when we think about environmental justice and reparations, one of the things that I think is really important is to realize that we have to go all the way back to enslavement to really understand how these landscapes came to be the way that they are. So you have these, it's probably hard to see. This is a great book to take a look at it. It's does really excellent work with maps. There is a line here that's really hard probably for you all to see, but these are the historic plantation boundaries. So it's showing how these plantations then were transformed into this industrial landscape, right? So when we think about what would reparations look like in this landscape, what would environmental justice look like in this landscape, we need to have a long history, right? 1619. We need to go all the way back in time and start thinking about how did we get here and what would be justice in this situation. There's some ways it's very hard to imagine justice coming forth because the landscapes are so polluted. But I think I can say that I really don't believe that justice looks like just buyouts and displacements. The people of Africatown are fighting very hard to stay where they are. They don't want to be bought out, and the buyouts would not even be enough money to buy a house pretty much anywhere, I think, because the houses are very devalued because of the pollution. And they want to stay where they are. They want to stay in the land that their ancestors have lived on for many years, the place where their ancestors are buried. So this is just a kind of summary of some of the stuff I've been talking about. When we think of reparations as an ongoing process that involves truth-telling, apology, compensation, which is monetary, but not only monetary, and then structural change, again, saying we have to change the system. We can't just deal with one town. We have to think about all of these places and how we find a way toward justice. So I'm going to skip this one and go to this one. So this is a current NSF grant that I'm working on with friends from University of South Alabama, Tennessee State, Penn State, and Oberlin. We are interested in, we have put in an application or an NSF application to study the impact of this road. This is the Bay Bridge Road. It was put in the 1980s to facilitate access across the Mobile Bay. It went straight through the heart of Africatown. The one ways you could tell this is that here is the cemetery where the ancestors are buried. Here's the Union Missionary Baptist Church, which is where Cudjoe Lewis and other survivors of the Matilda used to go to church. There is now literally a 4-lane freeway going in between, so people cannot walk anymore from their church to the graveyard. And in fact, a member of the congregation was hit by a car and killed when he was trying to do that not long ago. So it's unsafe. It took out businesses, it took out homes. There's the question of whether there were more graves that have been paved over by this construction this construction project. So one of the things that is being talked about within environmental justice now is how do we go back to these neighborhoods that were so damaged by this post-war infrastructure boom and start thinking about what a reparative approach would be. Do we take the freeway out? How do you compensate the people whose businesses were relocated and never really recovered from that? Or the people who lost their homes? What about the people whose ancestors' graves have been paved over? What lots and lots of questions in there. And I think the key is to recognize this is not just happened in Africatown, it happened all over the country, in Black neighborhoods and Latinx neighborhoods mainly. These roads were constructed that were meant to help industry or people to get from the suburbs to downtown, but they were done at the expense of communities of color. And those threats tend to multiply. Sorry, talking through my mask eventually always gets to me. What's happening right now is that they're talking about putting a toll on the other bridge road. So there's 2 bridges that go over the Mobile Bay. They're talking about putting a truck toll on the other bridge. And the people of Africa are saying, you put a toll on that bridge, they're all just going to come through our neighborhood. There's going to be more traffic, more pollution, more exhaust, more dangerous chemicals coming through our community. And there's going to be more danger from these big trucks, plus noise pollution, which people don't even talk about, but is a huge thing. So this is an ongoing fight that, again, keeps stretching back, right? Back to the 1980s with this road construction project, back to enslavement, with the fact that this community, this free Black community, has been targeted in so many ways. So just a couple things that I want to close on, and I want to give a chance for questions and discussion. One is to say that Africatown has a really vibrant, thriving vision for their future. So if they could get the city council to listen. So I think that's really key to know, that there is a better future for Africatown that people are fighting for. But I also think that I want to come back around to being Oberlin students and faculty, being the community here, thinking about what it means to engage in environmental justice work. And I think that the thing that has been most powerful to me about teaching at Oberlin is the fact that we do create a community here where we bring together our different skills and our different capacities and our desire for justice. And we work together with communities to start creating that better world now. It's not just something that we're thinking about for the future, right? And we need to support each other. We need to be able to have these conversations with each other, to sustain each other in this work when sometimes it can feel really overwhelming. And I think the little things that seem like little things are actually very important. I think cooking dinners together in a co-op is really important. I think having conversations with each other and being in class together and struggling and thinking through these issues together is really important. I think that revolution doesn't only look like protests, right? It looks like cooking food. It looks like planting gardens. So this is another one of my community collaborators, Val Scott, who is part of the urban gardening movement and the Midwest, the Rust Belt cities that is very much a Black-led movement. And this last thing is so often, this is a photo of Standing Rock. So often I think that we talk about despair and hope as sort of the two ways that we think about climate change. But I teach my climate change class almost every year. And one of the things I always say is we need better vocabularies. We need a better way to talk about this moment that we're living in and how we find the ability, how we find the strength and the energy and the hope to keep moving forward. So there's lots and lots of things that come out of doing this collective work and doing this collective actions together, whether it's cooking dinner at a co-op or whether it's going to Africa Town or whether it's going to OCS and working in the garden there. There are lots of different ways that we feel and act as we're living through this moment in time. And hope and despair are there, but they're not the only things. There's lots of complicated ways that, in a sense, that we know that our work is part of a bigger work. We're part of a bigger movement. And all of those things are what keep us going, right? Having a community here is what keeps us going in this work. So I've kind of gathered different ways that students have talked about their experiences of living at this moment in time and put them up here as a way of expanding our ability to talk about our experience and our values and our desires for creating a better world. Okay, so we have 10 minutes for questions. 5 minutes? 5 minutes for questions, discussion. And I'm interested in any questions or comments that you have. Yeah.
What was the one version?
Oh, it's called Barracoon.
How you spell it?
Barracoon. Barracoon was the pen that people were kept in before being put on the slave ships. It was actually, she wrote it back in like the 1920s and 30s, but it was not published until 2018. So it just came out in a way. Other thoughts or comments, questions? Yeah.
I was just wondering if there's different ways, like what we can do to get more representation on the same policy.
Right.
That seems like the number one solution.
It's really key.
And I was wondering, what community you
Right. So when I'd say take environmental policy with Swap the Patek, but John, do you actually mind? I know you've done a lot of policy work here at Oberlin, so I'm wondering if you could talk about what that would look like at a grassroots local level.
Well, I guess one thing I would say is just to ask students to reflect on what Jay's contributed today in terms of the projects we're engaged in,
right,
and the conversation with students now that you'll have with community members soon, and just,
right,
just thinking about this sort of lens of looking at the community engagement and trying to understand where people are coming from so relevant about how you engage in these conversations that you are engaging with people.
And I really, you'll hear this over and over, but I just want to emphasize again, relationships are so important. There has been about 2 years now where we have not been able to travel down to Africa Town. That's been really hard. And yet the relationship that we formed with community members has sustained through that in spite of not being able to travel down there. I just saw Major Joe at the conference, and it was great to see him again. They're ready to re-welcome us. And I don't know always how much practical impact we've had as Oberlin, and we have created something called the African Digital Archive, which is really great. But I think a huge important piece of what's happened is that our students have shown up and given the community a lot of love and respect, and the community is giving that love back. And so that's the foundation. Anything that we do is going to come out of that respectful relationship. And that is something that all of your faculty here at Oberlin, John and Rumi, and I especially have community engaged projects going on. And that's really important, knowing that you all as students, you are part of that really ongoing relationship. Even if you're here for 4 years, you're carrying something forward that has came before you, continue after you.
My guess, Jay, is that these are in no way ordered, but I see that it's very meaningful to me that empathy is at the top, because I think that is such an important, as we engage with communities, really try to understand where people are coming from and see the world through their eyes.
Yeah. I think that an example I often use is that Pastor Williams, who has been a real mentor to me. He's a pastor in Africa Town. He's a former police officer. I know that most Oberlin students probably don't have a lot of sympathy for the police, and I have come to understand he retired from police force and took up this job, which I'm sure he thinks they absolutely nothing to do as a pastor in Africa Town. It's because he wants to protect people. That has been his orientation his whole life. Maybe I wouldn't think being in the police is the way I would want to do that, but understanding that that's what he is, the one who brought a lawsuit against the polluting industry in Africa. He led that lawsuit. So having empathy, trying to understand how people and their different ways of life, how we are actually working together for something, even if we have different ways of doing it. Right? I feel like I should probably let y'all go. I don't know, John, what's happening, but my students are pretty exhausted. I don't know what happened, but I think especially anybody who's been here since summer, maybe is just at the edge. Thank you all. It was great to be here.